Well, hello and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to the executive forums and Ipsos community from around the world. My name is Cristina Paez, and I am the current country manager in Ipsos Ecuador. I am also honored to be a forum leader to a fantastic group of women in business in Guayaquil called Las Morfinas, that I know they're here with me today. Welcome, Morfinas. I am delighted to be joined today by Ben Page. Ben is the global CEO of Ipsos, a leading market research company with offices in 88 countries around the globe, with over 18,000 employees and tending to more than 5,000 clients. He joined Ipsos UK in 1987 after graduating from Oxford University. Ben is a frequent writer. I know he loves giving speeches and do public presentations. He's a well-known speaker on topics including trends, leadership, and of course, management. And I know, Ben, you have led thousands of studies on consumers and citizens' behavior. You have also worked with big global companies, to mention a few: IBM, Facebook, Unilever, Google, and so forth, which are all clients of Ipsos worldwide, as well as for international organizations like the World Bank and the World Economic Forum. Speaking of which, I know you are in Davos right now at the
Yeah.
2022 annual meeting, and we'll go back to that in a minute. What an appropriate setting for the topic that we are going to review today. I know that throughout the years, Ben, you have also conducted hundreds of studies looking at organizational performance and the role leadership plays in the success of these organizations. So, for the next 30 minutes, you will walk us through a series of very interesting data points, and I hope you can share with us insights on what should great leaders focus on and what should we actually ignore. And something that I really look forward to seeing is, why do so many managers not do the obvious? Please,
Ah,
the community that we have here today joining us, do share with us your questions using the chat box that you see there. And I will make sure I read your comments and or questions to Ben in the end of the presentation. Welcome, Ben, and
yes.
welcome everyone who has kindly decided to join us today. Ben, please, the microphone is all yours. Thanks for
Thank
being
you very much. Thank you so much, Christina. And the things I'm about to talk about are from my own career. I never wanted to be a chief executive. It was never my dream job. I just didn't really want anybody else to be the chief executive. So in the end, I ended up running, first of all, one of the regions of Ipsos. And now, of course, I lead the global business. I'm going to try and show you some slides, which I hope you can all see, and move them. Oh, I can. Look at that. Marvelous. So if you and my colleagues have amazing technology, so you can tweet along. If you think if I'm saying the right things, you can use Twitter. I'm Ben at Ipsos, or you can email me if you want the slides, and I'm sure executive forums have copies for you as well. And what I'm really sharing with you today is what I found in my own experience running a series of different businesses, and then also a lot of data from one-to-one interviews with chief executives that I have done as part of projects over the last 20 years, and which I myself have learned a lot from. So, as Christina says, Ipsos is a big global research company. We cover a lot of countries, and we also employ people doing a lot of very different jobs. So obviously many of them are analysts in offices, but we also have thousands of people who are out on the street all over the world interviewing face to face. We have people going into shops, doing mystery shopping. We have thousands of people in call centers. So, and I think what I found interesting is how what other chief executives have told me seems to apply in most businesses. So after the pandemic, I think it's a good time to really reflect, particularly as in many knowledge industries, we have moved from working in offices to a much more hybrid form of work, but also we've seen a lot of change. So to me, at the moment, there are a number of things that if you're in a leadership role, you should be thinking about. The first is what your business is about. And I'll talk a little bit about the trends on purpose and company values, which have been accelerated during the pandemic. We then have, in many countries, but not in China because they're still in lockdown, but in many countries, the post-pandemic world with a reopening of the economy, the war for talent, but also now, of course, the number one challenge in the world, inflation, as we come out of the pandemic. And then, of course, the things that always matter in business or in any organization, how we appreciate people and culture. And one of the things I have learned is the importance of culture. It doesn't happen by accident, and leaders have to help manage it and create it, because the fish, the fish rots from the head down. And so we as leaders determine the culture in our organizations. And another way of defining culture, of course, is the worst thing that your organization is prepared to tolerate. That is what your organizational culture actually is. And so it really, really matters. And I think hopefully I will show you in the data that it really, really matters. So certainly we can see, as we, even before the pandemic, but accelerating during the pandemic, the proportion of people out there in the world who say they want to buy from brands that reflect their personal values. I'm showing you 3 countries here: Britain, my own country, but also France and America. But it's happened all over the world. People are saying they're reflecting on their values and what is happening in their country as a result of the pandemic and being in lockdown for a lot of time. And more people saying they want to buy brands that reflect their values. They're really thinking about what matters. We've also seen, when we ask chief executives how they judge other companies and business generally, you can see they always say, well, what are the numbers like? What's their financial performance like? You can see that there on the left of the chart. And every time that's number one. But you could also see over the last few years, the proportion saying social responsibility has gone up 10 times. The proportion saying sustainability has gone up more than double. And the proportion saying ethics and values and honesty has nearly doubled. So that's a big change when other things like the quality of management, what's your overall brand like, those things haven't really shifted anywhere near as much. So business is thinking differently as we come out of the pandemic. And across the world, what we can see is that business often was seen as doing a better job, and I know this is often true in Latin America, than the government in the country in terms of looking after people and helping the country deal with the pandemic and recover from the pandemic. But what's interesting is, of course, we're now seeing in some ways a sort of fade out of that effect. And so people are starting to become more questioning again as we go back to normal. But certainly business was seen as doing a good job in looking after people and responding to the pandemic. So as we come out of the pandemic, and probably the pandemic was long enough really to start seeing some changes perhaps in values there, we need to be careful because it's still early days. It takes a long time for human values to really change. But certainly we can see more people who are the people who were left in the workplace during the pandemic saying they're feeling under constant strain, higher among the youngest employees who often have smaller flats and apartments than older people in terms of living with it. And overall, in many countries, we can see more people saying that actually remote working has been good for employees. It's been able to, I feel they've supported my health and well-being. And interestingly, home workers are more likely to say that than people who have to go and work in a factory or on a site somewhere. So generally, people appreciate some of the changes. And although we're now reopening the economy, the Great Resignation, I'm not sure. In many markets, we can see that actually, yes, there are now more people changing jobs, but actually it is only returning to the average before the pandemic. In my own company, Ipsos, yes, staff turnover increased in 2021 after 2020, but it only has returned to how we were in 2019. And actually, if you look at around the world, as I do, we're in 90 countries, there are hotspots like America, like India, like parts of China. But overall, I think it's not necessarily changing as much as we might think. And overall, pay is not keeping up with inflation. But concern about inflation has now globally, and you can see it here in the orange line, is now well ahead of concern about COVID-19. Concern about COVID-19 coming down and down and down, and concern about inflation rising. And in fact, I just, before I started this call, looked at the latest numbers, and that number's already gone 2 points higher. It's at a record. And at the moment, we'll see what people are doing, but they're still, the consumers are still waking up, and employees are still waking up to the challenge of inflation. So when we look at how people say they will react, a lot of numbers on the chart, you don't need to read it in detail. At the moment, people say they're cutting back on going out, on eating out, on buying a new fridge, a new cooker, or a car. Not very many people at the moment saying they're going to go and demand a pay rise. And we will track this across these countries to see if we are going to head into a sort of wage price spiral where people feel they've got to get more money. At the moment, employees are sucking it up, but we will see. At the same time, I think it's worth reflecting then that if we're in an unusual environment, record inflation, but also record low concern about unemployment in many countries, at the same time, change is overrated. And the reason, why I say change is overrated is that when you look at why people are leaving jobs after the pandemic, the reasons pretty much are often the same as before the pandemic. And the key reason is always the same. It's always top of this list. It's you, it's me, it's their manager. And they leave because of the manager more often than because of the pay and benefits. And that, I think, is something that we must always reflect on. It's not just about fixing things with more money. And so what I wanted to share with you today is data that I've taken from a number of studies that look at how organizations perform as rated by independent auditors who have not seen, and I'm sorry the slides go slightly funny on this platform, but it should be okay. The auditors who have given the scores to the companies I'm showing you here have not seen this data. So they didn't know how employees in these companies felt about their employer. So the first thing I want to show you is that the ones that are rated as excellent performers on the left here are a bit more likely, or nearly twice as likely, to be rated as great places to work than organizations that auditors looking at their overall performance would rate them at. So the poor performers, as rated by the auditors on their financial performance, on their overall diligence, only 18% of people working there say it's a great place to work. In the excellence, it's 33%. So that was interesting to me. Interesting, though, this is a key point. No difference on happiness with pay. The excellent performers don't really have anything statistically significant in terms of better pay. Everybody everywhere is about the same proportion in saying their pay is great or rubbish. So pay often is a hygiene factor. It's not the key determinant. Bureaucracy, maybe the top performers have found ways of stopping people having to fill in forms and apply in triplicate or ask 20 people before they do something. And there's a small pattern, but nothing really significant. So every big company, every big organization has to have a certain amount of bureaucracy to control costs, to make sure there isn't too much waste, to make sure there isn't corruption, etc. It's not about the amount of bureaucracy. So then I thought, oh, well, this is great. So what else matters? And actually, interestingly, when we looked at, is it that people are nicer in successful companies? No difference. People are nice in terrible companies, and people are nice in brilliant companies. Is it perhaps that people in really great companies find their work more interesting than people in terrible companies? No, no difference. You can be in a hospital that is brilliant and a hospital that is terrible, twice as likely to kill people by accident. The staff working in that hospital will be just as likely to say work is interesting. The surgeon is very interested in you, even if he's twice as likely to kill you. Or the shop assistant is twice as likely, is just as likely to say the work is interesting. Is it perhaps that the excellent organizations have found a way of letting their staff go home early, or maybe making them work harder? No difference, really, no significant difference. So I thought this was very interesting. And then we, of course, say, well, okay, so what is the big difference? What's the big difference that we need to look at? And this I found very compelling. And because I grew up in an organization and I've been in the same organization for decades, so it was much smaller when I started. But I used to think a lot of the things I'm about to show you were just corporate speak. But actually, as I've studied the data and then done the job as chief executive of different organizations for decades now, I've discovered that these things do actually matter. So the data is probably right. And so the first thing is, and I'm sorry that the slides have gone funny on the platform, but nevertheless, the excellent leaders are better at managing performance and listening to staff. Look at these big differences in people feeling that they have an input into job plans. Look at the difference on feeling you have the opportunity to show initiative. And look at the difference between the top performers and the bottom performers in just telling people very clearly how they're doing. It's a really big difference. So we know that we don't make plants grow faster in our garden by pulling them out every 5 minutes, looking at the roots, checking how they're doing, putting them back in the ground again and saying, carry on. But some organizations I've worked with actually cannot even send emails out to members of the public without a manager reading them first. And strangely, those organizations are not very productive. So we need to give people freedom in a framework. We need to make people feel listened to in a framework. This does not mean that you have a trade union deciding everything or a workers' council deciding everything, but it means that people feel listened to and that they feel that they can have a say. And those are the things that seem to distinguish the top performers more than pay or just the absence of bureaucracy, more than people being nice. It's around this autonomy, initiative, being told how you're doing, and knowing what the hell is going on. Spending time communicating, as we are today, is really important. 5 times more likely in the top performers to strongly agree that they are being kept informed about what is happening. It's a really big differentiating factor. So my message to anybody who finds themselves in a leadership role, you have to make time to do the all-staff meeting. Even when you're busy, you have to make time. You have to make time to do that newsletter, because you may think, well, I'm too busy this week, we'll skip it. But they notice, and it's one of the key differentiating factors. Asking people before you do something, rather than just coming down the hill like Moses in the Bible with a list of instructions that you've worked out. This is what you need to do. We need to make people feel that they've had a share in that decision, twice as likely to feel that they've been consulted before you went on your brilliant plan. So really important to make time for that consultation. We're not necessarily always going to do what the staff tell us, but we can explain why we're doing it. Really, really matters. And a key thing, I think, is this difference between the chart on the left, my overall objectives of the organization, and my unit's overall objectives. So what's interesting is there is only a 20 percentage point gap between the best organizations and the worst organizations on the unit you're in. So you may be working in marketing, you may be working in product development, you may be working in distribution, you may be working in oncology, you may be working in street sweeping. But in that department, the norm is that most people feel they know what is going on and what their individual department or unit or team is trying to do. But the big difference, and this is something I have learned in my own career, human beings want to feel part of something bigger than themselves. And so the big vision stuff, the overall goal of the organization, that really, really matters. People don't just care about their individual department. They want to know how the whole organization is working and what the organization as a whole is trying to do. And nearly a 40-point difference between the best and worst in terms of the number who strongly agree that that they understand the overall objectives of the organization. And some of the organizations I've worked for, major supermarket chains who are often very good at this, they spend a lot of time on focusing their staff on a few things that they know really make a difference to those consumers. And if you get that right, you have that focus and people can buy into it. So that there is a really big difference just between the excellence and the goods. So a really big difference between the excellence and everything else. So that overall vision thing really does matter. Even better if you're able to build it with the staff. And then when you're going to change things, again, communication comes up yet again. The best, when they have to restructure, when they have to announce the new 3-year plan, are spending a lot of time making sure that people really understand why they're doing it, rather than telling people, just do it. Instead, we've explained why we're doing it. So these things to me really stand out. And the reason I want you to think about them is not just because they will make your life easier if you spend time on them, but also because the most potent, most powerful form of communication in this century is the same as in the 5th century or the 10th century or the 15th century, and that is word of mouth. And so look at word of mouth, much more important than email or any other sort of stuff you might get. Among the excellence, nearly half the staff strongly agree that they're going to go around and tell other people they haven't met out in the community that you work for that this is a great place to work, that the products are great, etc. It's nice that in rubbish organizations here, 20% will still go around saying it's great, but they're more than double as likely, more than twice as likely to do that among the top performers. So it does really, all of those things really correlate with great word of mouth. So the bottom line is that if you have to choose between giving bigger pay rises or getting your managers to spend more time focusing on these soft things, the people skills, the communication, actually the manager's individual behavior, having that team meeting every week, the huddle about why we're doing things rather than just throwing money at people, the individual manager's behavior matters more than pay. If I give half of you on this call the ability to give your staff, I don't know, a 5% pay rise next year, I give the other half the ability to give the staff a 12% pay rise next year, there will be no difference in the performance of those two groups of people. It will all come down to how the leaders on this call behave. And so things that continuously come up as needing improvement are people knowing, here you are again, the same evidence, how do I fit into the bigger picture? Does anybody care about me and what I do? And what people need in their jobs is very different if they're a truck driver than if they're a brain surgeon. But either way, they need to feel that somebody is caring about them and how they do their job. And then finally, and particularly for knowledge workers, feeling that they're able to realize their potential. Because, when we talk about vision or we talk about our plans, sometimes people produce things like this, and human beings, nobody goes to work and remembers any of that. They're going to remember a few simple things, and it's our job as leaders to communicate those. And if you're going to do that communication, you then need to think about how you're going to do it. And one of the things I think I found really interesting is this data point. Do you want to do just one-way communication, perhaps through email? Do you want to do virtual, like we're doing today? Or do you want to actually go and physically see people? And although physically seeing people is difficult, if you look at the level of trust in terms of believing that I will do what I say I will, it's a message to me that I am going to have to get on an aircraft much more often than I have been able to, because those site visits, those group chats, they are the thing that people find most trustworthy in real life meetings, much more so than email. Although interestingly, the new technology that has come on board during the pandemic, as we embraced Zoom, as we embraced Teams, actually does give us an advantage against just simple newsletters. And so if you found this working during the pandemic, stick with it. But ultimately, we need to still see people in real life and make time to do that. So what are people saying when we poll them about what they want from their manager? Regular, be timely, tell people how they're doing, what matters. Everybody wants to know how they can do better. Say thank you. The greatest human need is to be appreciated. It's not about money, or we'd all be trying to be investment bankers, but it is to be appreciated, to feel recognized. And then, as we've already seen, to feel involved, particularly when decisions are made about me. So none of these things are new post-pandemic, but I do think there is a new focus on them. And this chart may be useful to you. This is some analysis from my colleagues at Carrion and Box, who are our employee research practice. And of course, when they talk about change, and many of us are having to restructure businesses, particularly with potentially in 2023 recession in many markets. Again, what happens in a time of change? One needs more psychological safety, one needs more support, one needs more empowerment, one needs more authenticity from people like me. And it may be that we don't always have good news, but people appreciate the truth. And if they feel that you're telling them the truth, you're involving them, you can take people through some really difficult decisions, but it means even more expectation of you as a leader. So my favorite catchphrase is from a British management consultant called Peter Drucker. And his point was, how you are as people, your culture. It eats strategy for breakfast, and then there's a great British breakfast on a plate for you. You can see why our life expectancy isn't always brilliant. But anyway, culture eats strategy for breakfast, and then it has structure for lunch. And that getting that right inside your business is so important. So why don't we do this? And I was just reflecting on this because I've worked with hundreds of chief executives, and I secretly divide them into different groups. I look at the performance of their business, and then I look at what they say about leadership. And interestingly, all of us tend to talk about leadership in very similar ways: setting clear goals, being there for people, telling the story. We're quite consistent generally about that. However, what's interesting is when you examine the diaries of senior leaders and you look at the difference between the rhetoric and the reality, what you will find, and what I have found in my own studies of dozens of different leaders, is that some people do it and other people talk about it. And when I look at the reasons perhaps why people don't ultimately deliver or don't do it, this is what tends to come up. So one is a general anxiety, and being a leader is a lonely job. And so that worry about performance, as I put it here, you're always at war, you're desperate for the numbers. Actually, rather than relaxing a little bit, letting go and building a shared ownership of those goals, rather than just cracking the whip, that tends to work better. There's also a real risk for us all of low emotional intelligence, and we're all blind to certain things that we do. And a lack of self-awareness is one of the greatest weaknesses. It's a no-brainer, you might say, but it's amazing how many people exhibit it. And then, as I say, not making time for communications, thinking that we can do it once a year or something like that. I've put in here failure to use random acts of kindness, because a little random kindness goes a long way. People always remember you if you make time for them, if you say thank you in a particular way, particularly when they're not expecting it. And then I think there's some people don't bother with some of the things I've talked about today because they believe, well, you just tell people what to do. They understand why it matters, and then they do it. And it doesn't work like that. We have to engage people in a story about how our organization makes life better, why we do the things we do. And finally, a lack of drive. And I was reflecting on this. I mean, and I don't feel particularly driven, but I remember in one study, I spent with 40 chief executives. I spent 3 hours with each of these men and women talking about their lives, talking about how they had their career progress and how they had ended up in the job as chief executive. And of those 40 people, 2 of them told me, well, one of them told me, you know, Ben, at the end of the day, it's just a job. And they got fired within 6 months. Another one was so pompous and self-satisfied that he felt he was so important that nobody else really mattered, and he'd made it to the top, and so he didn't need to do anything anymore. If you wanted to see him, you had to make an appointment with his secretary and then go and wait outside his office. Well, that guy, he got fired too. So I think you do need a drive, but it is not about you. It is about your people. And if you can get those things right, be aware of the blocks and your own weaknesses, you will be great. So I think that's pretty much it. I think we are starting to see changes from the pandemic. We're seeing more expectation of business. And I think there's more risk of burnout with people working remotely. We've got to work out how we will navigate hybrid working for many knowledge businesses, because we aren't going to go back to exactly how it was before. But at the same time, I think it's worth remembering that actually most of the things that people want from an employer haven't really changed. They want decent line management. They want a great culture. And we need to think about how that will happen in a world of perhaps more flexible working, where we've given people more control, which they'll really appreciate, but we still need to get them engaged. And it's harder to do that through a screen than in real life. And I think finally, there will be a crisis coming out of this pandemic. I'm not sure that we have seen it yet. We're still too close to the trees to see the forest. The new inflation is the next crisis. But it means that people want your attention. They want transparency. And that demand for that, I think, is only going to rise, which is just another reminder why, even though it's difficult, even though you're busy, do the right thing. And we know what the right thing is. Thank you so much for your patience and for listening today. I will shut up.
Well, thank you, Ben, for that inspiring and practical presentation. The philosophy of collective intelligence we go by has endured for years. And I believe after hearing what you just said, is more necessary than ever to actually put it into place, because the moment demands it. I have a couple of questions in the chat box and a couple of comments that I'm going to read. But first, I was writing some notes while I was listening to you. And I wanted to share with you and with the audience that actually we have been carrying out some studies in the region, in the LATAM region. And I think this applies to many countries around the globe. But specifically in the LATAM region, we are seeing that trust in governments continues to fall. And actually hope is being put on the shoulders of companies and brands, something that we didn't really see as strong before. But now with the pandemic, that is only getting more and more strength as time passes by. So on civilians, on people like you and me to tackle today's challenges. We also know that organizations that are purpose-led, as you just mentioned now, with people aligned for that purpose, are actually more successful than other organizations that have no clarity on what their vision is beyond making profit for their stakeholders, which is, of course, our main objective. But there's a difference between prosperity and actually just making more and more money, which is something you would usually focus on in the previous years. But that is something that is changing. And just like the last comment before I jump on to the questions, is that great company culture also is now a prerequisite for job seekers. So if you want to actually retain and attract the best talents to be a part of your team, you need to start stepping up and thinking differently, thinking outside the box. So before I go back and ask you to please take us to Davos with you, since you're actually there, and I find this fascinating, I am going to read a question that we have from one of the members that is actually listening to us right now. She has a question. This is Lisa, and she's asking you, is there a way to track how people are working from home right now? We're finding that the younger people are not staying as focused and productive, and this has drastically declined productivity in the workforce, to the point that the older employees, actually both in age and length of time in the business, are noticing it and they're getting angry.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't recommend it, but there is surveillance software that some American companies like to use, so they can see keystrokes, and actually they can even look at whether a face is paying attention to the screen and working. But I think I'm not sure that is that's measuring the symptoms, not the disease. And I think a key issue here is, and it's a real challenge particularly for organizations that have, and most organizations have higher churn among young people. So we've hired, of course, thousands of people during the pandemic, and the younger ones may have never worked in an office before. And now they're working in a kitchen somewhere, or in their bedroom in some cases. And I think we have to double down on bringing people together, even if it's only for a few days physically. And actually, so I believe in giving people flexibility and control and letting them work when they need to. But one of the things that we have in some Ipsos countries is a people deal, where we are very clear about what we expect and what we get in return. And I think if people aren't part of an office culture where you almost absorb it by seeing what other people are doing around you, it may be that young people just assume, well, 4 hours work a day seems to be fine. Nobody's saying anything. So I think setting out very clear expectations is important, but at the same time recognizing, where those people are at. I wouldn't do micromanagement over checking them every 5 minutes on whether they filled something in. But I think we do need, particularly for newer workers and younger workers, we do need to insist, and it's quite hard. We've got real issues in some countries, that they spend 1 or 2 days together with some more established workers, because so much of what we learn at work is sort of tacit knowledge. It's stuff that it's not even necessarily taught, and it's not in an instruction manual. It's just there. So I've noticed that, there's people who are on calls, and I'm like, you really can't look like that on the call. I mean, I know it's fine, it's me and I'm relaxed, but if you suddenly meet a government minister or a CEO, they're going to think, they won't take you seriously. And you can pick that stuff up in an office because, when I go to see the Prime Minister, I'll put a tie on, but they aren't going to see that. So I think we really do need to use offices for what offices are really needed for, which is actually about serendipity. It's training, it's building culture, and leave people at home to do specific tasks that need focus. And being really clear about the balance of those two things in people's work is something that we have to do. But and the other thing is, we don't know yet how this great work at home experiment is going, really. Most of the evidence is workers enjoy it, they feel more control, and there is some evidence in some of the global studies of a little bit more productivity. But it may be that by 2027, we say it was a disaster and we're going to have everybody back in the office. We're too close to the trees to see the forest. I don't think we'll go back to the office for 9 to 5, but we really need to look at our young people's development. And in a way, offices allowed us to be lazy about that in the past. Now we have to be much more deliberate.
I love that thought on using the office for what the office is for. I love it. Great advice. I am going to read 2 comments that I think that are aligned with what you just said. Evelyn says, listen and communicate with the team is key for all success. There is nothing better than that. And Leo Bottery says, the Edelman Trust Barometer says that the reason employees look to one another is because they trust each other more than the CEO and other senior leaders.
Always true. Always true. I mean, your job as chief executive is not to be popular. And I think one of the key things actually is that I didn't show you all the data, you'll be pleased, because I have more slides. But one of the things the data shows is that believing that the chief executive and the management team are completely aligned on the overall vision is one of the key correlates. And that is more important than liking the chief executive. So it's almost inevitable that you will trust your fellow workers more than the guy in the suit or the woman in the suit, Christina, than the CEO. But it's not, the job of the CEO is not to be popular. The job of the CEO is to be clear and transparent and fair and listening.
Yes, I totally agree. And that is something that I believe it's going to be changing as years go by, but we're still like in the middle of the forest.
Yeah, I was just looking at Darminder's comment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To continue, now please do take us to Davos with you. I know this year's meeting, please.
Davos is an interesting place. If you haven't been, it's, I've just been with the Prime Minister of Belgium and various people. I mean, everybody is here. A lot of people are here, but I'm still not sure I would fly all the way from Ecuador to come to this meeting, Christina, or all the way from Mexico City or Brazil or somewhere like that. It's interesting. And in fact, interestingly, because of, I think, the change of governments in Latin America, your continent is actually underrepresented. There are loads of North Americans here, very few Latin Americans, no Chinese, no Russians, they've been banned, lots of Indian people who are looking for investment in India. But it's a slightly strange moment, I think, as we come out of the pandemic, but also which is still locking down China and Hong Kong. And also, of course, the war in Ukraine with all of the disruption that's causing. Generally, I would say, with a lot of listeners in Latin America, this is actually your time. Europe is disrupted. Latin America usually does well when Europe is at war. And so I don't want the war to continue one more day. But actually, in some ways, you're just as well you're not in Europe.
No, I know. And it's a good point you bring up, because as business leaders now, and with all these changes that we're seeing in the way we see the world and what we expect from companies and from brands, and the hope we're putting in these stakeholders to actually make a change and tackle today's challenges, is how do we multiply efforts and invite our teams, our clients, to join this new vision that seeks not to generate wealth, but rather prosperity, and to create a better impact, a better society, a better, to have a legacy? Is that something that you think we should be worrying about or focusing on?
Of course. Yeah? I think there are lots of reasons. I mean, the first is in terms of motivating our people, actually, particularly our younger employees. There's a very strong correlation between motivation, willingness to work hard, discretionary effort, and believing that your company or your business or the organization you work for is actually not just making money, but is doing good, whether it's raising money for charity or providing practical help. And I think giving people time at work to go and actually spend time paid for by the company to work on projects in the community, this type of thing, it's good for the employees, it's good for the community. All of that actually, and it actually improves employee motivation. So it's a virtuous circle. Business on its own is not going to fix the world's problems. It's still got to make money, but there's a lot that it can do. And I think business is taking on, particularly after the pandemic. You can see, particularly in countries with fragile health systems, for example, we see more and more businesses actually looking after their employees' health. And one trend in many countries is for businesses to now have a chief wellness officer as well as an HR officer. Our colleagues in Shanghai, their main task at the moment is to get food to people in lockdown, which sounds like because they literally, some of the young people are so used to relying on delivery services, they didn't have a 10-kilo bag of rice in the kitchen, which is apparently what you should always do in China. So no, I think there's a big space for business. Ultimately, though, and businesses together can do things, but ultimately it does require state action, and that is one of the challenges in many countries, particularly in Latin America. But business can do a lot, and people working want to make a difference themselves, and it helps the business perform better. So it's a virtuous circle.
Yes, it is. Share with us some of the discussions that are taking place right now, and how do you think we as business leaders can contribute to accomplish those goals?
Well, I think you first of all have to choose, because if you're talking about environment, ESG, CSR, there's a huge, are you going to do environmental things? Are you going to look after poverty? Are you going to fight poverty? I mean, the range of things that you might get involved in, I think, is enormous. And I think that means that you probably need to choose something that's appropriate for your brand and for your business, rather than doing everything. So at Ipsos, we're focusing on young people, educating young people, refugees, for all sorts of reasons. But we're not doing everything. We're going to work on climate change, carbon reduction, but you can't do everything. And I think brands like Patagonia, I don't know how many people listening know the clothing brand, but whatever you choose, of course, it has more impact if you stick with it. And you're consistent, and that will and you then say, this is what we've done this year. You amplify what you're doing. If you change what you're doing every year, it becomes harder for people to follow. So I think choose that area where you can really make a difference, whether it's education, whatever your employees want you to focus on, and then really look at local engagement, and maybe talk to recipients, talk to communities about what will help them most. Because it may not be actually you going to go and do gardening or painting, Christina. It may be better for your people to work on the board of charities, helping them with their marketing or communications. And so I think, or they may just want money. And if they just want money, then maybe we go and work out how we can raise more money for charity, we can, etc. So understanding those things, I think, really, really matters. The people who know what they need are the recipients, not you and me.
Yeah, I totally agree. I know you have some very successful initiatives that you put into place in UK, where you offered your team members the option of donating 2 days out of the year to social responsibility programs of their liking, which is another idea as well that actually has come to me. And I have heard people from UK talking about it and getting really excited about it.
Yeah, and I mean, to be honest, most people don't bother taking it. But the fact that you offer people that opportunity, in fact, in the end, I let the people who wanted to do it do 4 days, because paid for by the company, because only about 16% of people wanted to do it. But it's a really great story. Some people are looking after their families. They've got other responsibilities. They just don't feel they have time. They just, etc. But I think, giving people that freedom. We also actually gave people time just to go and read, to learn new things that might help them at work. Everybody from the cleaner through to the receptionist, through to the researchers. And again, not everybody uses the freedom and flexibility, but they appreciate that the company offers it to them.
So in a global company and in your new role as the global CEO of Ipsos, what initiatives do you think can apply? And would you suggest kind of like pushing?
No, I think we should all, we can encourage more of our people to give their time to charity, and we can, as a big company, we can afford to let them take that time to go and do that work and make a difference. And the other thing is, as you know, Christina, curiosity is one of our 5 values. Things like integrity and collaboration, a lot of businesses would have those. But curiosity is one that is quite unique to Ipsos. And the reason for that, we're a people business. We're a search about people, what they think, what they feel. And encouraging people to keep learning is really, really important, I think. And so again, giving people permission to do things is very important, as long as we stay focused on obviously serving clients, which is how we pay our bills. We can give people much more freedom and flexibility. And what I found is, and I don't know if people in Britain, where I used to be in charge, are different than in Latin America. If you respect people and give them clear goals, and which they share and understand, you can give them more freedom than you might have imagined, and they will still deliver for you. But you have to trust them. But at the same time, of course, be very clear about what you expect.
Agree. It is imperative that we as business leaders, as you mentioned before, understand how relevant our clarity of vision is and our unity of purpose. That is something that I really, really appreciate from Ipsos, and I have lived by for the last couple of years. And I can see, and I don't know what your thought is on it, how that translates to performance in business. It goes beyond team satisfaction and alignment with the purpose in the corporation. But in the end, how do you translate that and measure in the return of what the investment is?
I think again, some of these things are difficult to measure, but at the same time, if you've got a culture where people feel that they are being given, they're trusted, they're given freedom to try new things, they know what the objectives are, but they are given some freedom to meet those objectives. When the crisis comes, when you need them to work all day or all night, during COVID, we had to literally work 24 hours a day and sleep in the office in order to deliver a COVID testing program for the UK government in 10 days. So people were literally sleeping in the office and working literally in shifts 24/7. But I think people were willing to do that, one, because they knew it was important, but also because the company previously has given them space, has given them time to go and look after their child that was sick, to go and see their mother who was sick. And so the argument is that it's about it's about a relationship ultimately. It's not just a transaction. You have the company has trusted you, so now I will give something back to the company at the time when it needs it. So you build up really a stock of, I suppose the word that is social capital. And you've got that, and if you build that up, you then have a reserve that you can use in hard times. Maybe you have to fire people, maybe you have to cut pay. I cut my own pay by 20% during the pandemic. I cut other people's pay by 10% because I could share with them the numbers, but they didn't complain, they didn't leave, because they knew I was honest and I would only do it if I had to. So it's about building that social capital. And I think the pandemic has been a time when we lived off the social capital of that we had built up before the pandemic. And the challenge now, as we go into this new world of hybrid working, young people who are not used to working in offices, is how you will rebuild your social capital inside your business that you have as a reserve for when times get hard. That was great. I'm going to have to run away now to some other exciting things, but I think you've got it. I've said everything I'm going to say that's interesting, Christina.
You have, and this has been very enlightening, and
Pleasure.
Thank you again for being here with us. I have a couple of people are asking me about the presentation. Yes, we will share
Christina's got them, and they'll be even better without the slides going funny, which they went on the screen. So Christina will get you those slides.
I will. And maybe we can arrange for another presentation for those other slides that we didn't see today, that I'm sure they're very enlightening too. So thank you very much, Ben. Pleasure. And thank you all for joining us today. It's been great. And I hope to see you again. Enjoy Davos, Ben.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.